In September 1993, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, also known as Abu Ammar, shook hands on the White House lawn. The negotiations leading here were secret and mediated by Norwegian politicians. The talks were conducted through shadow organizations to maintain secrecy and cover everyone's tracks. The Oslo trade union think tank, FAFO, did a study in the early 90s on the living conditions of Palestinians in occupied territories. But it was a cover for these secret negotiations between the PLO and Israel.
As part of FAFO's standards of living survey that was undertaken in the Palestinian areas, I had authorized money for this project. These were the money that could also fund the talks in Oslo.
Oslo would have not started if, for example, FAFO would have not invited us to go to Norway. I would presume that if FAFO would say, pay for yourself, Oslo would have not happened. I mean, this is, funny things, but that's life.
All what we did when it came to stationaries, all the papers were all sort of on FAFO paper in order to leave no traces of any kind of official Norwegian involvement.
Thorvald Stoltenberg decided to use the Norwegian Research Institute, FAFO. Haidar Larsen was the head of FAFO at the time, so he also asked me to ask Mr. Arafat to receive Haidar Larsen in Tunis.
The parties didn't want to do it directly with the foreign ministry because they wanted to have what they phrased deniability. So in December 1992, I flew to Tunis and met Arafat.
سألوا لأبو عمار أسئلة مو بس عن مستقبل القضية الفلسطينية، سألوا عن علاقاته مع القيادات العربية وغير العربية. كيف بتشوف موقف الفلاني، كيف بتشوف موقف فلان من القضية الفلسطينية، كيف بتشوف موقف إيران من القضية الفلسطينية، كل بالتفاصيل. شو موقف الحركات الإسلامية في العالم، وبدأ اللقاء الساعة 9 مساء وانتهى 2:30 صباحا. أبو عمار ما بخل عليه ولا بجواب.
In this house, 100 kilometers from Oslo near the Swedish border, 2 Israelis, 3 Palestinians and 4 Norwegians met 3 times in early 1993. These gatherings led to what later became known as the Oslo Accords.
The Oslo negotiations actually started with 2 Israelis. One of them is me, the other is Dr. Yair Hirschfeld. We were 2 academicians with huge knowledge about the history of the conflict. We will always play as if we are representing Begin and Peres. I had also my contacts within the Labour Party. I knew Yossi Beilin, I knew Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres was a friend of my parents, so I knew him very well.
هم كانوا يحاولون أن يقدموا أنفسهم في البداية على أنهم هم أكاديميين لا علاقة لهم في القرار السياسي، لكن هم لهم صداقات في مؤسسة الحكم الإسرائيلية. كان الحديث أنه هذا الوفد هو وفد ممثل لمنظمة التحرير الفلسطيني.
Abu Ala came with 2 people that the Norwegians didn't know and thought that they were his bodyguards. But they were, one is Hassan Asfour, who was from the office of Abu Mazen, and second is Maher El-Kurd, Dr. Maher El-Kurd, who was from the economic expert from the office of Abu Ammar, of Arafat.
The whole negotiations language was in English.
Yeah, and whenever the Palestinians felt that they need to say something which is more accurate in Arabic, they talked in Arabic and was translated to English by Maher El-Kurd, and we, both of us, we know a bit Arabic, so we could also assist.
وفي 2 3 أبو مازن، أبو عمار وأنا هم الذين يعرفون عن هذه المفاوضات في تونس.
In the Norwegian government, it must have been 3 or 4 people. The Prime Minister, myself, and the Defense Minister. But that was all. We had a meeting with Thorvald Stoltenberg in his office. He said, nobody present, none of you will be involved at all.
Who were you?
Well, we were 4 people from our ministry. I will not name the others, but I was one of them. And this was again the matter of deniability.
The Norwegian team, which was based mainly on the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jan Egeland, his right hand, Mona Juul, the wife of Tari Larsen, and Tari Larsen.
We started talking about very private things. Families, sons, how they grew up, their wives, their kids, and in order to have them to relate to each other as human beings, they had to live in the same house, have breakfast, lunch, dinner together, and not leave the premises for the time that they were there.
بتوفير الأجواء، بتوفير المكان، بتوفير متطلبات يعني نجاح مفاوضات وتسهيل الدخول والخروج بشكل أولاً لائق وبشكل غير يعني بعيد عن كل وسائل الإعلام. فبالتالي النرويج لعبت هذا الدور حقيقة بعتقد بكفاءة.
I briefed and cleared with my boss, Thorvald Stoltenberg, that we could do this. And I kept him updated throughout the talks, but he did not participate in any of the talks.
When they went back, we were very active, both on the phone, in order then, because they obviously didn't speak to each other then, so we were sort of, the messages going through to the two of them went sort of through us. And of course, we also then tested out sort of, I mean, certain things, either for the Palestinian to the Israelis and vice versa. Maybe do you think you could accept if we did like this or we do like this, and I mean, these kind of things?
They were able to play, these very senior 3 people, the role of a soldier and of a general. Meaning, if we needed coffee, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs would have come with coffee. If we needed an idea, he would come with an idea. If we needed that somebody would speak with Foreign Minister Christopher, State Department, so the same man who brought us coffee was also able to speak with Christopher, which is, from our point of view, was a classical environment, allowing us to dictate what should be their role. And it was perfect. It was the best.
In his book, The New Middle East, Shimon Peres wrote, "The Norwegians were a gift from heaven." After the first round of talks, the Israelis began drafting what they called a declaration of principles.
The second meeting, which took place some 3-4 weeks later, was, from my point of view, the most crucial meeting to make this meeting of 2 sides into a channel. And what happened then was that we came with a paper.
This paper was discussed with Beilin?
Beilin saw the paper and endorsed it.
The logic of Oslo is that you started with the easiest and then you postponed the most difficult, hoping that the parties would find a way as they walked that road to resolve the more difficult issues.
All the difficult questions, security, Jerusalem, Palestinian refugees, borders, you name it, all of them were taken out, and they should not be discussed.
قيل في حينها، وهذه تم المناقشة يعني بعمق حولها، إنه هذه القضايا طرحها سوف لن يترك مجالا للتوافق.
What should then be discussed? It was self-rule for the Palestinians in Gaza and in the small city of Jericho. And it was self-rule on certain, I think 5 specific areas, as education, tourism, health, and so on.
فعلا هذا ما قلنا، إنه إذا هذا هو اللي بدكم إياه، إذا أنتم بدكم تبقوا على الاحتلال وتغيروا الشكل الفاقع إنه كمحتل إلى دور إنه في يعني موجودين فلسطينيين يديروا شؤونهم الداخلية تحت سيادة هذا الاحتلال يعني طبعا يعني وهذا حقيقة ما كانوا يفاوضوا على أساسه.
We are ready to let the Palestinians run their own life in their own environment, have a self-government.
To solve in Oslo the problems that we had in the negotiations in Washington, which led us to nowhere.
My counterpart, Yossi Beilin, whom I kept contact with, saw that enormous progress was made in the talks with Abu Allah, who was a real leader on the PLO side and would not have made his concessions without Yasser Arafat knowing and clearing it. Abu Mazen was also involved throughout.
The talks continued in Sarpsborg near Oslo, 2 days a month. Meanwhile, the official public negotiations in Washington, D.C. came to an abrupt halt when Israel expelled 400 Palestinians to Marj al-Zuhur in southern Lebanon.
كان أبو عمار يعني يطلب منا دائما أنه نذهب لمصر لوضع المصريين، وخاصة دكتور أسامة البازي اللي كان مستشار لرئيس مبارك أيامها.
El-Baz sent word to Tel Aviv that Arafat approved Israel's first proposal that the PLO could have a foothold in the Gaza Strip and Jericho.
Specifically, the message related to the peace process. I will not go beyond that, unfortunately.
What we reached in the first 4 months was a document which we call the Sarpsborg document, which was, from our point of view, a pre-negotiation document. We never thought that this document could be signed. The Palestinians thought that maybe.
I asked the American embassy in Oslo to fix me up with a secure line to State Department. So I went up there and had updated them 2-3 times on progress towards the Sarpsborg, the initial draft agreement.
That was February 1993.
It was February and March and April where we did these things. And Thorvald Stoltenberg even gave the original draft, first version of the Oslo Agreement, if you like, to Warren Christopher. And he was very interested in this.
Hello, how are you? US Secretary of State Warren Christopher was monitoring both the secret Oslo and the official Washington negotiations. The Israelis decided after 18 months that the Washington talks were not going to reach agreement.
The United States is prepared, along with our co-sponsors, the Russian government, to play our role as partners in this process, to assist in any way we can the parties to move these negotiations forward.
We are always for anything that would make life easier, provided security and calm are sustained.
You don't know how frustrated we are. We came here with strong nerves, to show our intention about peace, but certainly we cannot bear the responsibility of continuing with a peace process that's not promising anything.
كان هناك إصرار على التمسك بالموقف الصارم الفلسطيني، وطبعا لم يكن أحد يعرف أن هناك مفاوضات أخرى تجري.
Nobody knew anything about the channel, and whenever there was some knowledge, we immediately jointly were able to quiet it.
We were, of course, criticized for this secrecy. But without the secrecy, it would not have worked at all.
The Norwegian Prime Minister announcing the departure of her foreign minister, about to begin a new role as UN peacemaker.
I have many friends in former Yugoslavia. I hope that I shall be able to contribute to a peaceful solution. I didn't really want to go to Balkan. And that was because I would like to see the Oslo process through, because I was then very optimistic.
Stoltenberg's successor as foreign minister was his brother-in-law, former defense minister Johan Jürgen Holst. Holst had been a strong supporter of Israel since the early 70s.
Johan Jürgen Holst was very keen. He asked for us to do whatever we could to make progress. He had already had signals from Terje Rød Larsen and Mona Juul, who of course knew him well through Marianne Heiberg, his wife, who worked at FAFO.
He knew enough And I briefly informed him, but I was also sending him messages when he asked, and he did some in the beginning. I sent it from Balkan to him, but he was by and large informed.
This channel was upgraded in May. That was after Mr. Holst had become Minister of Foreign Affairs.
The Israelis also introduced a new face at the Oslo talks. Their general manager at the Foreign Ministry, Uri Savir.
When Foreign Minister Peres asked me to look at this document and then potentially participate in this channel, I was very glad. I think that something good had happened to the PLO. They finally began to see that the armed struggle will lead them nowhere. That actually their biggest enemy is their biggest ally and partner, Israel.
They met for the first time up at a sort of small cottage up at Holmenkollen, which is the famous ski jump and the ski area in, just right outside Oslo. Abdullah slept at Holmenkollen Park Hotel, which is a hotel next door.
And Uri Savir, where did he stay?
I think he stayed in our flat that night. That's right, yeah.
I'm a big believer in secret negotiations. So at the end, the public knows the outcome and not the intermediary concessions. And therefore, we knew we had about 2-3 months. And in 3 months, we did it.
In this hotel near Oslo, Uri Savir used his first meeting with the Palestinians to stress 3 deal-breaking Israeli conditions. First, no negotiations over Jerusalem or the return of refugees. Second, no UN involvement or international arbitration. And third, that the public-facing Washington talks continue in parallel with the secret negotiations. The Palestinians accepted all 3.
بدأ سفير مرة أخرى يعصر في الجانب الفلسطيني ويحصل على مجموعة جديدة من التنازلات. وعندما انتهى قالوا لهم ولكن احنا من خارجية وهدول الخارجية يتبعوا لشمعون بيرس، لازم نجيب حد الآن من مكتب رابين، فأرسلوا أشرس المفاوضين وهو شموئيل زينجر.
Joel Singer's contribution was to ask hundreds of questions on the other side to really understand what this would mean, how PLO would treat this, what would be them as a counterpart. They, I think, felt it was quite offensive in one way to be interrogated like that.
من ضمنها أسئلة تشكل أفخاخ مثل هل توافقوا على بقاء المستوطنين في المناطق التي ستديرونها؟ وعندما حصل على جواب نعم يعني طار من الفرح لأنه هذا معناته قبول بوجود الاستيطان. وفي النهاية زينجر نفسه كتب قال أنا لم أفاجأ بحصولي على 100 جواب على 100 سؤال. ما فوجئت به أنني لم أتلقى مع 100 جواب ولا سؤال فلسطيني واحد.
Lawyer Joel Singer acted as a legal advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Following his first meeting with the Palestinians, he headed to Vienna to meet Peres.
Actually, when Peres came back from a dinner, and Joel wakes up and he looks at him, and I say, Joel, he said, Foreign Minister, if we don't make an immediate deal with these people, we are complete idiots.
5 months later, in July 1993, in the resort of Halversbol, Singer presented the amended Declaration of Principles document, setting out the details of Palestinian autonomy. It clearly stated that autonomy wouldn't include the settlements, military zones, or Jerusalem, and that Israel would remain in charge of security and the protection of settlers.
So what Joel Singer did, he deconstructed it, made it into a document with legal aspect. The Palestinians, one should understand, were shocked because suddenly all things that they were saying, but they were afraid to see them, were black and white. And it was a tough day for them.
The Palestinian delegation saw the serious implications of Singer's document and so returned to Tunis to confer with the PLO leadership.
Arafat wanted to enlarge the Jericho area into the Jordan River so he would have certain hold on his relationship with Jordan. That was quite an argument. Then certain authorities of the council, etc. And like in every negotiations comes the end game. And the end game was conducted by Holst going to Tunis.
Tunis klokken 4 om morgenen fredag I forrige uke.
فهو جاء إلى تونس لمقابلة الأخ أبو عمار، وأنا كنت في ذلك اللقاء ليطلع منه، وخرج ليقول عرفات أكثر حرصا ودعما للوصول إلى اتفاق حتى من أبو علاء ومن أبو مازن ومن الآخرين. يعني بالتالي هو جاد جدا وأكد ذلك للإسرائيليين.
It was very, very useful then to have the opportunity to discuss these issues also directly with Arafat, and we were then sort of also able to communicate that to the Israelis.
After these meetings with Arafat, Tahrir Larsen and Mona Juul went back to Jerusalem, to the whole Israeli team, and told the Israelis everything that Arafat had said and done.
And even a letter written by Holst himself.
Not even a letter and I think 11 pages with minutes from the meeting, giving the letter and the minutes word by word of Arafat's opinions, where he thought he can have something or lose something. All this was given to the Israelis.
It was more sort of a judgment on where the Palestinians and Arafat in particular were on sort of the whole idea of reaching an agreement. Johan Jørgen Holst was very much a writing man. He always wrote things, and he wrote almost everything himself. I mean, working for him was very difficult than working with other ministers, because he every time when he went to meetings, and the first thing on the plane, he sat down and he wrote down his impressions, and so that was the way sort of he worked. So it was very much a personal letter.
So this letter was handed to Mr. Peres at that time?
Yeah.
Extracts of these letters later appeared in personal memoirs, but no official record of their contents has ever been found in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. In the secret negotiations between the Palestinians and Israel, Norway's role as mediator was key, but those involved were careful always to cover their tracks.
In the new books of Shimon Peres, Foreign Minister of Israel, Yossi Beilin, Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel, Uri Savir, Chief Negotiator of Israel, and so on, there were many paragraphs quoting from secret Norwegian documents, letters that they, for instance, had received from the Norwegian Foreign Minister. But still, in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, no copies, nothing. From the period of 20th of January, when it started, until the end of August, it was nothing. It was no documents, no memos, just nothing from what had actually been going on in this secret Oslo project. We found out that Tahrir Larsen, he has admitted that he has many of these secret documents himself. And he refuses to give them back to the Norwegian state.
To do secret negotiations through a ministry is very difficult. because there has to be written reports. Lots of people will have to know about it. If you do it with a research institute, you can have just a tiny little group of people, and there's no duty to report in writing. So, and this is also how the secrecy was kept.
The secret Holst-Perez conversations led them to believe that the time had come to finalize a deal. Perez headed to Stockholm to resolve the outstanding points on the phone.
At the castle in Sweden, we are opening actually a hotline.
Who was there in
Perez
the
invites the Norwegian foreign minister and Tarjei Larsen and Mona Juul to be the go-between. They're sitting in the room together with Joel Zinger. Arafat and his team are in Tunis.
في ليلة الاتفاق على أوسلو بعام 93 دعانا أبو عمار بالليل إنه فوراً بدي إياكم. أجاني شيء من أبو علاء ومن جماعة أوسلو. إحنا كنا وقتها متزعلين مع أبو عمار، أبو مازن وأنا، في زعل. كان موارد المنظمة أصبحت شحيحة، فأبو عمار وقف الصرف على كل شيء بما في ذلك يعني أجارات بيوتنا وتليفوناتنا. نسينا كل الخلاف وذهبنا لعنده.
من كان حاضرا في تونس؟
كنا حاضرين في اللقاء هذاك 4 أو 5. أبو عمار، أبو مازن، أبو علاء، حسن عصفور، كان في شخص لبناني مقرب لنا محسن إبراهيم كان قاعد مشارك. فأبو عمار كان يحكي مع هولست.
Holst was talking to Yasser Arafat. And Peres could hear on the phone for the first time Arafat and his people. And they solved 6 out of 7 issues.
All the outstanding issues from the 6 rounds of secret negotiations in June and July in Norway were resolved in this 7-hour phone call between Stockholm and Tunis. In his book, Mahmoud Abbas later recalled, "A 7-hour phone call ended the conflict of the 20th century. The Palestinian people took their first steps towards freedom and emancipation. That call achieved what couldn't be done in 20 months of futile negotiations in Washington."
فأوسلو لم يتضمن لا كلمة إنهاء الاحتلال، إنهاء الاستيطان، ولا كلمة دولة فلسطينية مستقلة. ترك الباب مفتوح، وكل هذا بحجة إنه يعني حتى يقدروا يمرروا هذا المشروع على قياداتهم بما في رابين تحديدا. طبعا كل غموض، حتى نكون يعني موضوعيين، كل غموض هو في صالح الطرف الأقوى دائما. الطرف الأضعف هو الذي يسعى دائما للوضوح.
If you have a strong and a weak party, the strong party is the strongest. This is the reality of the world. And if then you have a strong party that is backed by the superpower of the world, the United States, it makes that strong party even stronger.
In this government guest house in Oslo, and in absolute secrecy, the Declaration of Principles was initialed by both sides. The secret signing was filmed by Norwegian intelligence, and the footage later used in a documentary for public TV in Norway.
Abu Allah being much more emotional than we had thought. I mean, he felt this was astronomic in a way, that he would be greeted by one of the leaders of official Israel.
Utenriksråd Avi Gil, sammen med Uri Savir, forhandlingsleder og departementsråd i UD. Peres juridiske rådgiver Joel Singer, delegasjonsmedlemmet Yair Hirschfeldt og professor Ron Pundik. Seremonien bevåkes av Holsts hustru Marianne Heiberg.
After midnight, the negotiators come to the government guest house, and then Shimon Peres is a witness as the official initialing happens with Uri Savir and Abu Allah signing this. Johan Jørgen Holst, Mona, Terje and I stand there behind them.
We had then our, what we call the secret police at the time, then doing sort of the filming or the video of it, and we had sort of prepared the little speeches.
We feel proud that this happened in Norway, and we hope that now that you entered into a new period of cooperation, openness, of building down all barriers and building up new cooperative arrangements and structures, that you will remember that we are always there if you ever again will need our services. But the task is yours.
On the first step of opening the doors of peace and on striving to achieve cooperation,
your people are lucky to have leaders like you. Mr. Perez, you're also lucky to have boys like this working with you.
Shimon Peres and Mr. Holst and two of his staffers and Mona Jewel and myself, we flew secretly to a military base in August 1993 in Point Mugu in California.
I mean, such a relief, because Warren Christopher sort of looked at it. Then he turned to Dennis Ross and he said, "Dennis, what do you think?" And then Dennis said, "I think this is great." And then I think sort of all of us sort of had a sigh of relief.
The Declaration of Principles said that the goal of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations was to establish a Palestinian Authority for a transitional period of up to 5 years. It would begin with the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and Jericho, and Israeli forces were to be redeployed outside the populated areas. The final negotiations were to start in year 3. Israel was to continue to be responsible for external security, the safety of settlements, and the overall safety of the Israelis.
حين فضح الأمر يعني زي صبيتي مي باردة على الوفد المفاوض ولا سيما المرحوم حيدر عبد الشافي.
Haidar Abdel Shafi asked the Palestinian negotiating team's legal advisor in Washington, Francis Boyle, to assess the declaration wording published in the newspapers. Boyle replied that it was the same Declaration of Principles that they'd rejected in Washington. "It's a limited autonomy of the inhabitants," he said, "without any control over the land." Abdel Shafi sent Boyle's comments to Arafat, but he never received a reply.
This is a mixture of previous self-rule agreements that the Palestinian leadership in the occupied territories always refused signing. And I think Edward Said said it in a couple of articles that he wrote in Arabic and English before the signing took place. And I think he was deeply shocked having read the Declaration of Principles.
In these articles, Edward Said wrote that the PLO had reduced itself from a national liberation movement to a small municipality. It was what he called the decay of the PLO leadership against the cunning of Israel.
كل الذي صار باختصار شديد إنه الحاكم العسكري الإسرائيلي نقل صلاحيات الإدارة المدنية إلى الحكم الذاتي الفلسطيني.
بدل ما أنا أخاطب إسرائيلي على شباك الإدارة، أنا أخاطب فلسطيني، والفلسطيني يشكل حلقة وصل بيني وبين الإسرائيلي.
اتفاق أوسلو كان أكبر فكرة عبقرية في تاريخ إسرائيل، لأنه ضمن استمرار الاحتلال دون أن تدفع إسرائيل تكاليف الاحتلال.
After the news of the secret Oslo negotiations had been leaked, it was inevitable that the two sides would bring things into the public arena. Israel started to use the Norwegians to demand further concessions.
بعتوا صيغة هي صيغة غير عادلة وغير متوازنة. إنه إحنا بنعترف إسرائيل، بس إسرائيل بتعترفش بفلسطين كدولة، بتعترف بالمنظمة كممثل للشعب الفلسطيني.
To complete the mutual recognition, Israel stipulated that the PLO not only renounce terrorism, but also commit to prevent all forms of violence and terrorism. And it encouraged the Palestinians to have a normal relationship with Israel from now on. Arafat agreed, and Holst flew to Tunis to witness Arafat signing these letters.
Yes, we had signed it. Yes. From my point of view, the exchange of letters are more important than the agreement itself, because the exchange of letters is doing the historical shift.
The Norwegians celebrated with Peres and Sevilla in Israel. Rabin announced that based on the PLO's commitments, Israel now recognized the PLO and agreed to negotiate with them. Back in Tunis, the PLO established the Palestinian Authority, which would gradually become the umbrella organization for the Palestinians.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arafat, Chairman of the Executive Council of the Palestine Liberation Organization, His Excellency Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, the President of the United States.
بفضل تأييد المجتمع الدولي، وأخص هنا بالذكر حكومة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية التي يقع على عاتقها الاستمرار في لعب دور فعال ومميز في المرحلة القادمة من أجل استكمال هذا الإنجاز العظيم.
احنا كنا يعني الإدارة الأمريكية لم تكن تتعامل معنا إطلاقا. بعد هذا الاتفاق بدأت تتعامل والغرب كله بدأ يتعامل.
The doors are opening for Yasser Arafat at the US State Department, champagne and laughter, swapping autographs with the Israelis and handshakes with Secretary of State Christopher.
They understood that if they have an agreement with Israel, it will bring them closer to Washington. And we understood that if you make an agreement, it can be gradual, and it will open up relations to the Arab world. We'll have better relations with Egypt, with Jordan. It was a strategic deal.
We were accepted by the world. Relations between us and Arab world moved dramatically. Interest officers, embassies, etc., etc. This immediately allowed the Jordanians to enter into serious negotiation with Israel, leading a year later into a peace agreement between us and Jordan. We were accepted with the Palestinians to all sorts of forums and forums that we were not accepted before. Huge investments came to Israel. Mega companies, Intel, Chinese, Japanese, everybody came.
Johan Jürgen Holst died 4 months later.
Johan Holst in Norway played an essential part in helping to turn the Middle East from a cauldron of hostility into a cradle of hope.
Later in 1994, Arafat, Peres and Rabin were all awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. Muna Yul was moved to the Norwegian embassy in Israel and her husband, Tarjei Rod-Larsen, to the UN working for the Palestinians. Responsibility for monitoring the terms of Oslo therefore now passed to the Israeli army.
Not only we were not invited to negotiate, but I would say that also our advice at that time was just evaporating somewhere. Even Yossi Beilin was a bit pushed aside. Not only us. It was given more to the military, more to the army, more to the security services.
The military leadership of Israel was for the first time exposed to Palestinians in negotiations.
يعني ببساطة التنسيق الأمني أن يصبح الفلسطيني وكيلا أمنيا لإسرائيل. وهذا النص واضح أنه على السلطة الفلسطينية أن تلاحق الإرهاب والإرهابيين. وأيضا لا تسائل العملاء والجواسيس، ممنوع مساءلتهم أو طردهم من وظائفهم أو ما شابه ذلك.
اللي علينا عملناه، اعتراف متبادل وعملناه، وتنسيق أمني عملناه، كل التزاماتنا طبقناها. هو اللي عليه أنه يعمل، هو المحتل.
الطموح كان أن نصل إلى اتفاق ينهي الاحتلال ويعيد الحقوق الوطنية الفلسطينية للشعب الفلسطيني. إذا لم يتحقق ذلك بلا شك أنه هذا إخفاق.
Mr. Yasser Arafat, he gave too many concessions too easily. People got used to him giving up. By the end, they had nothing more to give, and they expected him to give more.
Thank you very much, and let's meet again in the next round of negotiation.
אם נקבל ערובה זו לפירוז ולסידורי ביטחון הדרושים לישראל, ואם הפלסטינים יכירו בישראל כמדינת העם היהודי, נהיה מוכנים בהסדר שלום אמיתי להגיע לפתרון של מדינה פלסטינית מפורזת לצד המדינה היהודית.
انظر الآن نتنياهو حتى الآن استعمل اصطلاح دولة فلسطينية عدة مرات، دائما يقول دولة فلسطينية منزوعة السلاح. لم يقل ولا بأي مرة من المرات دولة فلسطينية مستقلة ذات سيادة، لأنه يعرف معنى ذلك، وهو لا يقصد ذلك إطلاقا. عندما يقول حل الدولتين ودولة منزوعة السلاح هو يقصد أنه سيتواجد في غور الأردن عسكريا، وبالتالي لا يوجد سيادة.
Illegal Israeli settlement of the West Bank has continued since 1993. Palestinians believe that the Oslo Accords ultimately benefited Israel more than themselves, and that this expansion on the ground is part of the price they have paid for Oslo. Dror Etkes is an Israeli expert on the settlements, and he tracks their development. The West Bank constitutes 1/5 the area of historic Palestine. Today, more than 300,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank, not counting the 200,000 in East Jerusalem.
The Oslo Agreement is actually the best thing which happened to the Israeli settlers and the Israeli settlement enterprise, because it's created exactly the basic conditions which this kind of project can bloom in. While the Palestinian population was supposedly taken care of by the PA, and there was supposedly some kind of a peace process conducted between the PLO and Israel, 60% of the West Bank remain open for Israeli development. This is exactly what you see here. It's a period which Israel had intensively and effectively used in order to over triple the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and to change completely, irreversibly, the West Bank landscape. Another good example is, of course, the bypass system, which is just under us. This whole bypass system was created after Oslo. There were the years between 1993 and 2000, which the Israeli population growth in the West Bank reached the fastest pace of growth ever. It was these years that almost the entire bypass system in the West Bank, the parallel road system, the parallel water system, the parallel electricity system, was built in the West Bank. They actually hardly have to see any Arabs today in their commuting, on a daily commuting between the settlement and Jerusalem. One cannot underestimate how important the bypass system was for the development of this all suburban reality which was created in the West Bank. And the bypass system, effective, modern, efficient transportation infrastructure is a precondition for the development of this kind of communities.
في فرق بين استيطان يجري ضدك وتكافحي ضده وبين استيطان يجري ضدك وأنت جالسة معهم على طاولة المفاوضات تعطيهم الغطاء.
Jews should have the right to enter Israel and to become citizens. This is my view as a Zionist. Now, if there is a majority of Palestinians under our rule, this is the end of this Zionist idea.
إسرائيل واضح إنه بالنسبة إلها الضفة الغربية لن تتخلى عنها. واضح. كل اللي ما بهمها إنه هذا العدد السكاني حوالي 2 مليون إنها تتخلص منه. كل الاستراتيجية الإسرائيلية تتمحور حول هاتين النقطتين: زيادة في الاستيطان واستثناء في العنصر السكاني. طبقا لمعايير القانون الدولي، أي شعب يقع تحت الاحتلال وتلزم سلطة الاحتلال بالتوقيع على أي اتفاقيات تمس حقوقه فهي اتفاقية باطلة بطلانا مطلقا طبقا لاتفاقيات جنيف.
إسرائيل هي التي كسبت من أوسلو. أنا لا أوافق أبدا أنه اتفاق أوسلو فشل أو نجح، أنه فاشل أو ناجح. هو اتفاق أوسلو فاشل تماما بالنسبة لأهداف الفلسطينيين، ولكنه كان ناجحا تماما بالنسبة لأهداف الإسرائيليين. صحيح في فائدة واحدة جرت من أوسلو، وهي أنه رجوع أعداد من الفلسطينيين إلى الضفة الغربية حوالي 100,000. هذا إنجاز، ولكن خسائرنا أكبر من ذلك بكثير. خسرنا وحدتنا، خسرنا المشروع الوطني الجامع، خسرنا دور منظمة التحرير وحركة التحرر الوطني لصالح السلطة اللي كلها تحت الاحتلال، وخسرنا زمن، خسرنا 20 عام.
The Oslo Accords were an achievement and the role of Norway crucial. But they ultimately proved to be a stage in the peace process. And the search for a just and lasting peace in the Middle East still continues today.